Hey guys, this is Josh here with Trillium Wild Edibles, and today I wanted to go through the identification of 9 wild edibles and medicinal plants, plus one plant that is known for commonly inducing allergies. So without further ado, let's get started. And today I wanted to do a short little identification video on Cleavers, or Gallium aperine. Now the plant that we're looking at directly in front of us is called Cleavers, or by its scientific name, Gallium aperine. There are plenty of cleavers within this family. This is a very large extended family, and there are multiple variations of this plant. Now in many states, this plant is actually known as a noxious weed, and it does spread rather easily. However, it is edible, and it does have a couple of edible parts. Now when it comes to cleavers, there are 2 different edible parts. One is going to be the seeds, or what's called the fruit, and the other is going to be the young shoots. This is a little too late for the early shoots. However, the tender tops of this plant are still technically edible, though they might be a little stringy. If you were going to eat these, you would actually want to boil them for about 5 to 10 minutes until they become tender to your liking. But let's say you don't know how to identify a cleaver and you want to know if this plant that you're looking at is a cleaver. So let's take a closer look at this plant in front of us now. Now one of the distinct things about cleavers is their growth pattern within the leaves. One thing you may notice is that these leaves are growing in a whorl, and it basically means the leaves are growing in a circular pattern around the stem, or a rosary pattern around the stem, just like you can see here. These leaves are very long, they're very narrow, they're lanceolate in shape. The reason I say lanceolate instead of lance-shaped is because they're long and they're narrow. On cleavers, you're going to find anywhere from 7 to 11 leaflets growing in this whorled pattern around the main stem, just like you can see here. Now if we look at the whorls or the leaf patterns on this plant, we're going to notice that they spread down every 1.5 to 2 inches. And then as you get further down the plant, they get more and more sparsely populated, meaning that they spread out more and more. Now if we take a very close look at the plant known as cleavers, or Gallium aperine, whenever it is in flower, you're going to notice a very, very tiny cluster, just like you can see right here, of white 4-petaled flowers. And they generally will grow out of the nodes of the leaf stems, or where the whorls come out of the main stem of the plant, just like you can see right there at the tip of my index finger. Now these flowers are so small that it's actually very hard to show them in great detail on camera just because of how small they really are. Thankfully, there are plenty other discerning features about cleavers. Mainly the way it grows. Not many plants will grow the way that cleavers grow. However, let's take a look at some of the other more indefinite clues that we're looking at a plant known as cleavers. Okay, now if we take another very close look at the plant known as cleavers, we're going to notice running along the stem these stiff little bristles. And this is actually one of the reasons this plant has this name, is because these bristles catch on things very well, especially your shins. And whenever they catch on your shins, they will cause little cuts, similar to what looks like from tiny little knives. Right here, I'll demonstrate the catching ability of cleavers so you can understand what I mean. These things cling to skin, they cling to clothing, they cling to everything. Now another really unique feature about the cleaver plant is that it does have a square stem. This is one of the few plants that has a square stem that isn't actually within the mint family to my knowledge. There are a few plants that have square stems, but generally most people want to identify a mint just because it has a square stem. Now another thing you might notice, just like you can see here in this view, you can also see that those bristly hairs also run along each one of the leaves on the margins. And in this video, we're going to go through 3 different kinds of chickweed that you're probably going to be finding. 2 of them are going to be found in your yard or around barns or mulching or landscaped areas, and 1 is going to be commonly found in the woods, in the eastern woodlands especially. So without further ado, let's get started. Now these very small and low, delicate plants that we're looking at are called chickweed. This is common chickweed. And the good thing about common chickweed is that it's not only very common, but it's also edible and extremely delicious. This is a plant that you can very easily teach your children about, and it's very easy for them to identify, and it's also very quick to collect. Now here, if we look really close on this chickweed, you're going to notice one thing first and foremost about the leaves. If we look at this plant from the top, one thing that we're going to notice is it has very simple leaves. These leaves are lance-shaped, and they also grow opposite, just like you can see here how they grow on opposite sides of the stem. Now if you look very closely at these opposite growing leaves, we're also going to notice that they clasp the stem, meaning they don't really have a petiole or any leaf stem that attaches them to the main stem or the main stalk of the chickweed plant. You may also notice on the edges or the margins of these leaves how they're simple. There's no teeth, they're absolutely smooth. There's nothing on the sides of these leaves, they have no lobes. The underside of the leaves is just a normal underside of a leaf. It's very lightly green. There's no discerning features on the underside of this leaf. However, there is a lookalike, a toxic lookalike to chickweed that's called scarlet pimpernel. It doesn't grow where I live. However, it might where you live. The discerning feature is on the underside of the leaves. So anytime you're picking chickweed, make sure you take a look at the underside of the leaves, because scarlet pimpernel has red spots on the underside of its leaves, whereas chickweed does not, just like you can see here. Now at the top of this plant here, you can see these little buds. These are what's left of the flower buds, because this plant is already flowered. So this plant is in the process of producing seeds, or it's in the process of getting ready to flower. Just depends on which stage this particular plant is at. However, whenever it comes to chickweed's flower, now one thing you might notice about the flower is not only is it white, but it looks like it might have 10 petals. However, there's actually only 5 petals on this flower. They just have a divide that makes it look like there's 10. Now another thing you might notice on this chickweed is how large these leaves are. This is growing in a much more shaded environment that also receives a little bit more moisture. However, it's right next to my trash cans, so I don't eat it. But this just goes to show that sometimes chickweed can be very, very large in size. Now one really nice thing about chickweed is that it adapts itself very easily to all kinds of soils. So you can very easily grow this in a container if you wanted to. All you'd have to do is simply find some chickweed that is past its flowering stage, like you see here with all of these buds. Then you would simply pull the tops of them up like this. All you'd simply have to do once you have these is, like I said, simply just shake the plant inside of a bag or a container, and then you can collect the seeds and plant them wherever you want to grow chickweed. Alright, so now that we've taken a look at common chickweed, let's go take a look at the second type of chickweed, and that's called mouse ear chickweed. Okay, here we are a little further down in my yard, towards the middle of the lawn actually, and here is a huge rosette or a huge clump of this mouse ear chickweed. Now, all intents and purposes, mouse ear chickweed is just as edible, and most of it looks the exact same. You might be able to notice a difference here in the way that it grows. This looks kind of scraggly. One other major difference with mouse ear chickweed over common chickweed is the fact that mouse ear chickweed, like you can see here, has all these little hairs and little fuzz running along the side of it. One issue about these is that it doesn't make it as palatable whenever you go to eat it raw, and I also find that mouse ear chickweed is also a lot tougher and tastes, in my opinion, a little more like hay smells. Everything on mouse ear chickweed is almost the exact same as common chickweed, minus the hairs. The flower is the exact same shape, as you can see. It does look like it has 10 petals, however, it's just because of those splits within the petals. Its leaves, as you can see here, right behind the flower, grow opposite of each other. If I pull this little piece up, you can also see these hairs a lot more. You can also notice that the stem on mouse ear chickweed is red, whereas on common chickweed, it's just green. But here you may be able to see that the split in these petals isn't complete. It doesn't go all the way down, and there are only 5 petals. Now the third type of chickweed that we're going to be talking about today, I like to call great star chickweed. However, you can also call it star chickweed. This chickweed is very common anywhere within the eastern woodlands. One thing you may notice is that its growth structure is very similar to regular chickweed. It doesn't form the same dense clumps. As you can see, this small little rosette right in front of me. However, the flowers are very large. As you can see, these flowers are much larger than chickweed. They're about the size of my thumbnail. They do grow the same way, and they are white. They do have 5 petals that looks like 10 because of those splits. And just like regular chickweed, the leaves are simple, they're lance-shaped, the margins are smooth, and they also grow opposite of each other. Now, a similarity between star chickweed and mouse ear chickweed is the red stem, like you may be able to see right here. This is a very small, low-growing plant. The stamens on the end of each pistils, as you notice, are red specks, so they're much larger than regular chickweed, so it's a lot easier to notice. You can find this anywhere in the woodlands within moist, low environments, and also on sloping hillsides where it receives a lot of drainage and runoff. You can see that this one is starting to produce some little buds right here, so this one is probably about ready to go to seed soon. And here's a little bit of a further back view so you can see just this one chickweed plant, and what I mean by it doesn't grow in the same dense clusters that regular chickweed or mouse ear chickweed do. All of these umbrella-like leaves that we're looking at in front of us are called Mayapple. You can generally tell a Mayapple because of these very distinct umbrella-like leaves. Now, another thing you might notice if you look really closely at the top of the Mayapple, you can see that the leaves are fully connected in the center here. You can see each one of these lobes that comes off that has another lobe on the end with these little bitty teeth that you can see running at the very end, the tip of the leaf. And if I remove this tulip flower, you can see the actual stem right there. This is the very butt end of the stem on the Mayapple. Now, one of the interesting things about the Mayapple is that you're sometimes going to see one stem or two stems, like you can see here. And out of the node, you're going to see the distinct flower of Mayapple. It hangs underneath these leaves, like you can see here. So it hides itself really, really well. And after this flower has been pollinated properly, it'll produce a fruit. And now the fruit of the Mayapple is what a lot of people try to eat, and it is edible. However, it's not edible this time of year. You have to wait until the later fall. Now, if we take a really close look at this Mayapple flower, you'll notice that the petals are starting to lose their color, and you may also notice this little fruit starting right here in the center of the flower. This is very typical. So this is a plant that we know is going to have a Mayapple fruit later on in the year. The flower of Mayapple is white, and it will have anywhere from 4 to 7 petals on it. Another thing that we can notice is what's left of these pistils here inside of the flower right by this fruit. Now, another really nice thing about Mayapple is that it is a colonizing plant, like you can see here. All of these young little Mayapples starting to come up. So everywhere you find them, anywhere you find one Mayapple, you're going to be finding a lot more, just like you can see here. Another thing about Mayapples is that sometimes they can hide mushrooms like morels. They can also be hiding other plants that you might be after. Right there you guys can see a little bitty tree frog sitting on one of these Mayapples. That's really cool. I thought I'd show you that. Now, another interesting feature at the end of the leaves, you'll notice how these lobes have these divisions. You'll see these lobes, how they split apart like that at the end of each one of these leaflets. Here's one example of a really good colony to Mayapple. You can see this very large grouping all right in front of me here. Now, I'm actually in a clearing. However, this clearing is starting to revert back to forest land. And that's one of the reasons you have all of these Mayapples growing here. Now, right here, you guys can see some more of these Mayapples growing right here along the edge of this road that I'm on. And if you look over there in the trees, you can see that this is a moist forest, and you can generally find Mayapples in moist and even dry forests. They'll grow almost anywhere. And right there you guys can see another one of those flowers coming out of the Y-joint of the stem on this Mayapple. And here's a really good look of another fruit that is just starting. You can see the pistils on the inside of the flower right around the fruit. And here again, here's my hand for a comparison up against the size of these Mayapple leaves. So you can see just how big they really get. But notice how most of these here have 2 stems. Generally, what I've noticed with Mayapples is whenever I see one that has a Y branch just like this, I generally will find fruits on it later in the fall. So that's something to keep in mind. Whereas if we look at this one here in the back, you can see it's just one Mayapple stem. There is no flower and there's no Y branch. The ones with the Y branches, I believe, are female plants, and the ones without them, like this one here, is, I believe, a male plant. And you have to have the males and the females together for you to get the fruit. And then now we also have this guy where it looks like one stem, but you can see the other stem that was right here that broke off. There you go, you can see the broken stem and that blackened color there. Now, like I said, the Mayapple is poisonous, Every plant part is poisonous except for the fully ripe fruit, and the fruit will be ripened whenever its skin gets yellowed, not bright green. So that's something to keep in mind. This plant does have medicinal uses as well. However, we're not going to talk about that because this plant is generally used for cancer. Now again, this plant is used for cancer medicine, so this isn't a plant that I know how to use personally, and it's not one I recommend you mess with unless you have somebody who knows exactly how to use it and how to use it safely. There are two different types of Joe Pye weed within the eastern United States. One of them is called sweet Joe Pye weed, and the other one is spotted Joe Pye weed. This is called spotted Joe Pye weed because, as you can see along the stem, you can see these reddish purplish spots or splotches that run all up and down the length of the stem. Now sweet Joe Pye weed does not have this feature, so that's something to keep in mind. However, both of these plants are both usable in the same way. They both have good medicinal use. Now a lot of people confuse Joe Pye weed with a version of boneset because as you're driving by it or you walk by it, it certainly looks like a huge, gigantic version of boneset. You can see these flower clusters here. They're kind of blending in with the trees. But here you can see that one up against the sky. Its flower cluster looks very similar to boneset, and its leaf structure looks similar at a quick glance. And the reason that is because you see these very large leaves. They look like they have the same texture, but they don't. These leaves, at the top of them has a kind of leathery feel, but it doesn't feel near as leathery as boneset. The underside of the leaves on spotted Joe Pye weed have these little bristles, as you can see here, whereas the top of them does not. The top of these leaves are completely smooth. Another one of the big differences between boneset and Joe Pye weed is boneset, or thoroughwort is another name for boneset, has leaves that are perforated by the stem, whereas Joe Pye weed has a whorl of leaves, as you can see here. You can see all these different little stems, and each one of these has a leaf at the very end of them. On spotted Joe Pye weed, something you may notice is at the base of each leaf stem, where it connects at the node to the main stem, you may notice these little red or purple tinges that you can see here. That's another identification factor of this plant. There aren't too many plants that look similar to this. Like I said, most people just confuse this with boneset, and they have some kind of similar uses as far as promoting sweating. Both of these plants can make you sweat. That's actually what Joe Pye used this. Joe Pye was a 17th century white man who claimed he was an Indian medicine doctor, when in reality he was just a white man who had some good knowledge of some botanical plants and herbs, and he used this Joe Pye weed to help treat typhoid fever. Now something else you may notice about Joe Pye weed is how large these leaves are. Here's my hand for a comparison. These leaves can get anywhere from 6 to 9 inches in length, and they can get up to 2.5 to maybe even 3 inches in width. They're very long, as you can see here. They're lance-shaped or spear-shaped, so they have this very fine point on them. The edges or the margins of the leaves are teethed or serrated, just like you can see here, all these little bitty teeth running up and down the side of this leaf. The stem of Joe Pye weed can get very, very big at the base. As you can see here, here's my middle finger for a comparison. It gets pretty close to the same size, just a little bit smaller than my middle finger. So this stem can get about 1/2 inch in diameter, is about the biggest I've usually seen it. And here's one that's slightly bigger, again, for comparison. There's nothing really unique about the stem of Joe Pye weed in shape. It's just a nice round stem. It's very stiff, feels very solid. However, like pokeweed, it is still easily broken when the plant is growing, so be careful of that. Joe Pye weed can get to a lot of varying heights, but usually I see it growing anywhere from 6 to 8.5 feet tall. You can see this huge plant here, and I'm standing straight up right now. And this thing is, I swear to God, this thing is almost 10 feet tall. This thing is absolutely huge. So these things can get anywhere from 6 to 10 feet tall. A lot of the areas I usually find Joe Pye weed growing are in clearings along the edges of tree lines. Like you can see here, I'm in between 2 tree lines. I'm actually on a trail. I'm in the middle of a forest right now, and there's a little bit of a clearing here, and this is where this Joe Pye weed is growing. Now you can find this stuff on the edges of fields, you can find it in clearings, in your yard. This stuff will pretty much grow anywhere that it can. Now some of the uses of this plant, like I said earlier, you can use this plant to help induce sweating for colds or flus, and it will help you to sweat. Most Eupatorium species like boneset will also do the same thing, and a lot of Eupatoriums, after they've been studied and laboratory tests, have been found to have a lot of immune boosting qualities, so that's something else to keep in mind, and that corroborates with a lot of historical uses for this plant for colds and flus. As far as using this plant, you can use the leaves and you can use the root. However, there are also historical documents that report various Native American tribes using the entire plant for teas or washes or decoctions. So keep that in mind as well, that there are not only different ways to use this plant, but you can use the majority of this plant for what you need it for. As far as the flowers on Pye Weed, both of them have like a purple to pink kind of flower. It's similar to ironweed, so it's like this magenta sort of color, whereas boneset has a white flower. So that's something else to keep in mind, that if you see a plant with really huge flower clusters like this, and it has purple or pink flowers, it's most likely a Pye Weed. And as you can see now, these flowers have already gone and died. There's nothing left except brown. There's no colors. There's no distinguishing colors left in these flowers. However, the distinct shape of this plant should be more than enough for you to be able to identify it, because it is a really easy plant to identify, and it doesn't have any toxic lookalikes to my knowledge. The only lookalike it does have is boneset, and they do share some similar uses. So that's kind of a good thing, actually. Now, within the United States, there are two different types of plantain that you're probably going to be running across more often than not. Now, the plant that we're looking at here is broadleaf plantain, or Plantago major. Now, each plantain is very easy to identify, and there aren't any lookalikes to my knowledge within the United States. This is called broadleaf plantain because, as you can see, it has these very broad, oval, or egg-shaped leaves. You can see they're shaped just like an egg, and the veins in these leaves, as you can see, start at one point at the petiole of the leaf stem, and then they rise outward. They radiate a little bit outward. And then they all come together towards the tip of the plant. Now, the sides or the margins of the leaves of plantain are going to be smooth. You're not going to see any teeth or serrations along the edges or the margins of these leaves. However, you may notice, like you can see here in this one, the sides or margins of the leaves can be a little wavy in look or appearance. Now, earlier in the year, this plant has a flower spike, a very distinct flower spike that's coming up out of the center of the rosette. However, it doesn't have its flower spike now, but I will put a picture down below in the right-hand corner so you guys can see what that looks like. Now, the broadleaf plantain usually grows in a basal rosette pattern. As you can see here, these leaves are growing in a circle around the main taproot of the plant, and that's what makes this a basal rosette. One of the good things about plantain, as you can see here, is it's constantly spitting up new, tender young leaves, just like you can see this little bitty guy here. And the good thing about that is this plant is not only edible, but it's also medicinal. And the edible parts of the plant are these young, tender leaves before they get too stringy. Whereas here on this big leaf, you can see these huge veins that run through this leaf, and these veins are responsible for the strings, which you can see those strings on the backside of the plant here. Now, broadleaf plantain and narrowleaf plantain are both in the exact same family that commercial psyllium is gathered from, and here you can see the seed spike that's left from Plantago major. And these seeds can be undoubtedly used the same way as psyllium husks or psyllium fiber. And that's one of the many uses of this plant for food, besides using the young tender leaves for a salad, is that you can use these seeds as a psyllium substitute. And now when it comes to medicine, this plant is very well known within the herbal community because of how effective it is, as well as how mild and gentle and safe this plant is whenever you use it for medicine. This plant can be used for medicine internally and externally. So that's a really, really good thing about this plant. As far as using it, it's useful for an astringent. It's very, very good for drawing out infections or boils or zits. You can use this to make a rheumatism wash or a poultice. This will help to cool the pain of rheumatism. This will help to relieve inflammation of burns, insect stings, and things of that sort because it is very cooling. It's astringent in nature, which means that it contracts the skin or it has contracting agents within it. So if you need to check diarrhea, this plant can help do that. Also, its leaves and root is very high in mucilage, so this plant is also very soothing to inflame mucous membranes of the mouth and throat. And that's another thing this plant can be used for, is for colds and flus to help you ease the discomfort or hoarseness of your sore throat. And when it comes to using the plant for medicine, the entire plant can be used. You can use the leaves, you can use the stem, you can use the flowers, you can use the seeds, you can use the root, you can use all of this plant for medicine. However, my favorite thing to do is just pluck off any good looking leaves like you can see here, because this plant will continue to put out new leaves all throughout the entire growing season. So the good thing about that is if you just keep plucking the leaves, you're going to have a constant supply of plantain growing in your yard. Whereas if you take the root, you are going to kill that plant. Not to worry though, because this is a noxious weed, and as a matter of fact, the natives of North America called this plant white man's foot, because it went everywhere we went. So this plant is extremely noxious, and you're not going to kill it in any way. Now the second major type of plantain that you're going to be running across is called longleaf or narrowleaf plantain, or Plantago lanceolata. Now as you can see here, it looks somewhat similar to the broadleaf plantain or Plantago major in the fact that it does grow in a basal rosette around the taproot of the plant. The veins of the leaf, which are responsible for strings, all start at the petiole and run somewhat parallel to each other all the way to the very tip of the leaf. Longleaf plantain has very long, linear shaped leaves, as you can see here, and the sides, or the margin of the leaf, is going to be smooth. You're not going to notice any teeth or serrations on these leaves either. However, as you may notice here, you may see on the surface of the leaves all of these little bitty hairs or little fuzz. And you may notice how the underside of the leaves on narrowleaf plantain are smooth. They don't have any of those hairs. However, those discerning ribs or veins are still there, and these are responsible for the strings in this plant as well. Just like its larger-leaved brother, this plant will spit up new leaves all throughout the growing season, so that makes it a really, really good plant to use for medicine. You can use all of this plant, including the root. However, I like to harvest it the same way. I like to just use the very tips of these young leaves and any good-looking leaves like you can see here. The reason I like to do that is because, again, this plant will continue to spit up leaves all throughout the growing season, so I have a continuing supply of these plants. Another unique feature about plantain is on the petiole towards the base of the root, you're going to notice usually a red tinge or a purple tinge like you can see here. And it's going to fade as it goes up and turns into the leaf itself. On some leaves, this tinge may be very dark like you can see here, or it may be very light like you can see here. On some leaves, it can be absent altogether like you see in this one here. Now this plant shares a lot of similar uses with its larger leaf brother. However, a lot of people end up using this plant more often than broadleaf plantain, and some field guides and some sources will say this plant is just a little bit more effective. In my experience though, I don't notice much of a difference in the effectiveness between narrowleaf plantain and broadleaf plantain. So that's something you may want to keep in mind and something you may want to experiment with. Usually I use both of these plants together anytime I'm using plantain. A couple of ways that you can tell this. One of the first and foremost is these leaves. You may notice on this leaf that there are 3 lobes. You may notice how they come to kind of like a point. On the sides or the margins of these leaves, you're going to see these very fine serrations or teeth running all the way down the side. Some of these leaves can get really, really big like you can see here, and this is one of the reasons it's called giant ragweed. Another one of the reasons is because it can grow all the way up to 15 feet tall. And if you live anywhere in the corn belt of the United States, you're probably going to see this plant growing along the edge of cornfields. And pretty much anywhere else it can grow. This thing is obnoxious as it can be. And one of the most obnoxious things about this plant is, surprisingly enough, this plant is the main cause for late summer allergies. Usually this plant is in full bloom and its pollen is spreading the same time you see the goldenrod's out. And a lot of people misblame the goldenrod for their summer allergies, when in reality it's this plant. Now there's also common ragweed, which is a little smaller. Its leaves look very, very, very different from this though. Like I said, on the giant ragweed you're going to notice 3 lobes. You may also even notice some of these very large leaves with even 5 lobes. The leaves on this plant are extremely variable. And you can see here on the same plant there's one leaf that's just ovate or lance shaped. It doesn't have any lobes at all. Now granted, this leaf has been chewed a little bit, but it only has 4 lobes instead of 3 or 5. So you're going to notice a lot of variation in these leaves. So don't really count on a distinct number of lobes whenever you find this plant. Right now I'm about 20 feet back or more from these plants, and you can see just how much they stick out. You can see how large those leaves really are. I mean, they are absolutely huge. Now some of the very unique features about this plant as far as identification is concerned is these very fine bristles running up and down the stem. These bristles are very stiff and they feel sort of like Velcro in my opinion. I don't know if you can hear that, but the more you rub them, you may also notice that they kind of rub off a little bit. You can see how it's now missing those bristles there. I'm not sure exactly what these bristles are supposed to do. They don't sting in any way. They feel just kind of rough and scratchy more than anything. And you'll also notice these little bristles on the leaves. I don't know if you can see them there. They're very hard to see. But you'll notice on the top and on the bottom, you'll notice how small these are on the very bottom, but they do feel kind of rough and almost like sandpaper. The leaves have a feeling of sandpaper in my opinion. You can hear that whenever I rub it, and you can see these, maybe able to see these little bristles here. You can see those bristles running down the veins there in the back of the leaf. These are what's responsible for that rough and sandpapery-like feeling. And on the stem, like I said, you're going to notice these little fine bristles or little hairs running all up and down this plant. You're going to notice them even on the leaf stems. And you may also notice that this plant grows with an opposite leaf structure, meaning that its leaves grow on opposite sides of the stem, just like you can see here. And it does this all the way up the plant. I'll show you a couple more in the area. And sometimes you might actually even find them alternating, but usually they grow in this opposite pattern. At least every time I see Giant Ragweed, its leaves are always opposite. Here on this one, you may see this red tinge running along here on the leaf stem. That's another feature that you might see on some of them, and some of them you might not. This plant has a lot of variations, and one of its Latin names, its first Latin name is ambrosia. So this is an ambrosia species, and a lot of ambrosias are in the aster family, meaning that they are very notorious for producing obnoxious pollen. And when that time comes, the pollen is going to come out of these flower buds. Now right now these are budding, haven't even started flowering yet. But when they do and they start releasing their pollen, all you have to do is touch this plant and you're just going to see pollen flying out. You're just going to see this yellow-like pollen flying out everywhere. And that's what's responsible for your summertime allergies. Here you can see this yellow-greenish flower starting to come out on this little bud here. This one's about ready to start flowering. And here you can see even more of these little yellow or greenish, yellow-greenish flower buds that are starting to come out. And this spike right here, all these little bitty green ball-like things will eventually turn yellow, and those are going to be the flowers. And that's where the pollen is going to release from. This plant can be so obnoxious, and you may be able to tell just how many flower clusters are trying to start right here. There's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 or more flower clusters just right here at the top. And then at the end of each leaf node, or at the end of each leaf stem, like you can see here, another flower bud is starting. If we go over here to the other side, we see the same thing. So this plant produces a lot of flowers, and that means a lot of pollen. So if you have late summertime allergies and you see this plant growing in your property, get rid of it. Some people actually experience allergic reactions just simply by touching this plant. So that's something else you may want to be cautious of. So if you are allergic to this and you think you might be, wear gloves whenever you pull it just to be safe so you don't get any possible allergic reactions. I myself know I'm not allergic to it, so I don't really worry about it. But that may not be the case with you, so it helps to be cautious. And you can see another one here getting ready to start flowering as well. You can see these little bitty yellow greenish-like flower buds starting. Here's a really detailed close-up of the start of these flower buds and these flower clusters. You can see these little hairs, these little bristles. Here you can see another really good close-up of the flower of ragweed. Now this plant does supposedly have some medicinal uses. I am not sure of what those uses are because I don't use it. However, this plant does have another use that I will talk about that I am attempting to try to use it for. Supposedly the stem, because it's very stiff and almost woody, you can hear, when I flick it, it kind of sounds like wood. And one of the good uses of this plant is you can supposedly use it for atlatl darts, which I hope so, and that's kind of one of the reasons I'm letting a lot of it grow, so I can hopefully get myself a good source of atlatl darts. How well it'll work, I'm not quite sure yet, but supposedly it was used in prehistoric times for atlatl darts. So maybe some of you guys who might be a little crafty may be able to may be able to get some sort of arrow out of this as well. I don't quite know. It may be something that's worth checking into, because it is very, very, very stiff. I mean, it might work in survival situations. It might not be a good permanent arrow or a good permanent atlatl dart, but it might work perfect for survival situations.